Hello and welcome. You're watching Ukraine Breaking News. My name is Maria Kagal, and today we're joined by Ralph Goff, former CIA officer, and together we will discuss the current situation in Ukraine, US politics, and what the future might hold. Hello, Mr. Goff. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Hello, Maria. Доброго дня. It's my pleasure to be here as well in lovely Kiev.
Why are you in Kiev right now, and what brings you to our country?
So, I spent 35 years working for the U.S. government in the Central Intelligence Agency, and I retired 2 years ago to start my own consulting business, and it's in the area of national security issues. But my main goal was to try and find some projects to work with Ukraine, because I retired after the full-scale Russian invasion. I retired in 2023, the full-scale invasion 2022 happened, and I felt that with my background, maybe there was some way I could help Ukraine against the war of Russian aggression. So I started a consultancy and looking for projects, mostly to try and bring foreign investment and foreign investors to Ukraine.
Have you visited Kiev before, and have you experienced shellings? And if yes, what are your impressions?
Yeah, so I've been here, 7 or 8 times in the last 2 years. My first trip to Kiev was in 1985 when it was still the Soviet Union, and I was a college student studying Russian, and I came here. But I have experienced some of the drone attacks and missile attacks here and in some other locations in Ukraine. And, they're terrible things for civilians to go through. But I think in my career with the CIA, I spent a lot of time in some unfriendly places such as Iraq and Afghanistan and the Balkans during the wars there. So I've learned there's a big difference between when someone is shooting at you and when someone is shooting towards you. And when I'm here in Ukraine, when I'm in Kiev or somewhere, I feel more like the Russians are shooting towards me but not at me. So I really tend to not worry about it too much.
So just sleep all night and not worrying.
At my age, it's better to get sleep than to get up and go to the shelter, yes.
Yeah, I get it. Sometimes I also think so. Okay, so in your view, who is winning or losing this war between Ukraine and Russia at this moment?
So that's a great question. And, if one were to mark it just by territory, of course, one could say Ukraine is losing because the Russians are slowly, daily grinding away, taking inches or centimeters of Ukrainian territory, but at a great cost of blood, right? But in terms of morality, I think Russia has lost the most. I think they've become bankrupt, not just economically as a country, they're headed for bankruptcy, but morally as well. Whereas the Ukrainian people who are defending their country, I think they have actually gained a lot in this. Now, I'm not trying to make light of the military situation. Much depends on Ukraine winning this war. And by winning, I mean holding on to their sovereignty, holding on to their identity, because they are, a lot of Ukrainians like to say, hey, look, USA, NATO, we're fighting the Russians so that you don't have to. And I believe that, right? And when I see the horrific losses on the battlefield, both on the Russian side, on the Ukrainian side, it makes me as an American feel a little bit guilty that we're not doing more, right? So that's kind of why I come here, I think, to ease my guilt a little bit. But in terms of victory, right, Ukraine and Russia are engaged in a completely new type of warfare that has not been seen before. So I think not only have the tactics changed, but the strategy has changed. And I think in the end, the political goals for Ukraine, the political goals for Russia will be something new as well. And we're talking about the identity of Ukraine and the identity of Russia. And we're also talking about the values of the West and the values of Russia and their allies.
So it's basically a little bit difficult to understand what is a win in this war.
Exactly. It remains, I think we won't define who won or who lost until it's over and we look backwards at it. Right now, though it is a clash of cultures, you look at, or I should say a clash of values. I mean, you look at who's on Russia's side, right? North Korea, Iran, China, right? Those are their main supporters. They all share values. Those are totalitarian states, right? Not democratic states, right? I think the West needs to pay more attention to the fact that this isn't just a battle between Ukraine and Russia. It's a battle between Western democratic values and totalitarian, authoritarian values of Russia and their allies.
And also Donald Trump has been actively promoting the idea of peace. And sometimes he says that he's losing patience. Do you think there is a limit to his patience?
I sure hope so, and I think there is. And look, I give President Trump a lot of credit for sincerely wanting to end the war, right? I think when he says the war is a terrible thing, it's terrible to see all the deaths on the Russian side and on the Ukrainian side, I think he's being absolutely sincere. I think what he needs to understand, though, is that with President Putin, he's dealing with a world leader who has a much different outlook on how the world operates. And I think, back in November when President Trump was first elected, there was a lot of concern here in Kiev amongst my Ukrainian friends. But I was able to tell them in November, hey, look, this is how it's going to play out, right? President Trump's going to come into office. He's going to say, I'm going to stop the war in 24 hours. He's going to learn that he can't, right? He's going to get angry, but he's going to get angry at Ukraine first, right? Because it's easier, you're closer. And he's going to get angry at President Zelensky. He's going to get angry at Ukraine because for Donald Trump, the war is kind of an unwanted distraction from other things he wants to achieve. So he's going to beat up on Ukraine, and Ukraine is going to have to take it because they have no choice, right? Which President Zelensky did. He pushed back in the White House. I give him credit for that. But in the end, he amended Ukrainian policies so that you have the mineral deal, right? And they've agreed to purchase weapons through Europe, right? It's more of a transactional relationship now. And then I also said, and then after that, he's going to turn to Putin and he's going to try and befriend him. He's going to try and flatter him. He's going to say, nice things about Vladimir. And because Putin is Putin, Putin is going to break any kind of deal that Trump thinks he can make. Then President Trump is going to get angry at Putin. And that's the stage we're in now. And I think the president is trying to determine how best to go forward to settle this war the way he thinks it should be settled.
In Russian and sometimes even Ukrainian media, both jokingly and seriously, people say that Trump is a KGB agent and that Putin has compromised him. Yeah. Is it even possible to blackmail the most powerful person in the world, basically?
One could say it's possible, but only if that person cares. And frankly, President Donald Trump is the kind of guy, I don't think he cares. I think, first of all, I don't think he's a Russian agent. And second of all, I don't think Putin has compromised on him. I think if either were true, we would see much worse signs. Yeah. And we don't, right? Putin would be extremely stupid to try and blackmail or coerce a man like Donald Trump. President Trump is far more complicated than Vladimir Putin thinks. And I think Vladimir Putin has drastically overestimated his ability to manipulate President Trump. And I think Putin is setting himself up for Donald Trump to show him what it's like when you make him mad.
You once said that the Biden administration gave Ukraine enough weapons not to lose, but not enough to win.
Yes.
Do you think there is truth in Trump's words when he calls it Biden's war? Because it happens like every day. He always talk about it. Or could the former US president have prevented it? Or maybe it is Obama's war since he remained silent when Crimea was occupied. Yeah. And do you think, is there a possibility to prevent this war at all?
Yeah, that's a great question, Maria. And I think there is some truth to what Donald Trump says here. President Trump says it's Joe Biden. That's not true. It does go back several administrations. And one could put the blame all the way going back to the George Bush administration, and I mean the first Bush administration, in how we've dealt with Russia through the decades, right? Since the end of the Cold War. But the main problem for our presidents have been every time they get in, they think they understand the Russians. They think they can make friends with them. They think they can manipulate how they view the West, and they always seem to be wrong, right? And in the case of the war, I don't think it was just the fault of the Biden administration. I think it was a fault of NATO. It was a fault of the Europeans, United States, for not coming together with a very clear and coherent strategy for dealing with a resurgent Russia, right? I mean, the collapse of the Minsk Accords back in the day, right? There was a lack of coordination, I think, between the U.S. and the European countries to achieve that. I think that the Russians exploited that, and I think Vladimir Putin became disillusioned with the sincerity of the West, right? I mean, he has a very false outlook on history. For instance, says, "Oh, it was guaranteed that NATO wouldn't expand." No, I mean, at one point there was talk of having Russia in NATO, which is very ironic considering why NATO exists in the first place. But you know, there was a lot of different formulas at that time, and in the end, Vladimir Putin chose to see things in his own narrow-minded way, right? Where he says the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest tragedy of this last century, and you know, now he's setting about to put things right in the way that he sees fit.
And what should happen for Americans and American leaders for them to understand Russia and that they're not gonna negotiate with Americans, you know, like a terrorist state? Yeah,
well, I think there's a few things here. One is, you know, Vladimir Putin, and particularly his disgraceful former president Medvedev, who has a habit of making very inflammatory postings in social media when he's drunk, I think. But, you know, everyone points to this myth that the Russians will start a nuclear war. I think that's 100% myth. I think the West mistakenly allowed Vladimir Putin to establish what I call red line dominance, right? Anytime it's like, oh no, we can't send M1 tanks to Ukraine because Putin will go nuclear. Oh no, we can't send ATACMS. Oh no, we can't send HIMARS. Oh no, we can't send this system. And every time, you know, we've crossed those red lines, there has been a nuclear war. I mean, my own personal opinion on Vladimir Putin is this is a guy who was afraid of COVID, right? I mean, for him, his own well-being, his own health, his own personal safety is more important than anything. And we see that when he's already caused the loss of over 1 million Russian men in combat. He doesn't care about anyone. He cares about himself. And someone who's afraid of COVID doesn't strike me like the guy who's going to play real nuclear poker. So I think the West kind of was naive and fell for a bluff when they should have done the opposite and called the bluff and doubled down on Ukraine.
And what is your assessment of the Alaska summit and all these interactions between Trump and Putin?
Yeah. So again, that was President Trump with his showmanship, and you know, I think it was a sincere effort on his part to cajole. As I said earlier, he would try to flatter and cajole Vladimir Putin, and it didn't work. I mean, personally, as an American, I was pretty offended by seeing a red carpet. Right? I think Putin could have walked across the tarmac without a carpet, would have been better. But Vladimir Putin kind of, if you look at it as win-lose, Vladimir Putin won at the summit because he was able to convince President Trump not to initiate any new sanctions, which, by the way, is one of the things that the Kremlin fears the most. Right? There are a sanctions packet right now in the Senate from Senator Lindsey Graham and some of his allies, you know, for secondary sanctions that I think, added to the sanctions that already exist, will do real damage to the Russian economy, which is very fragile. I mean, the Russians have created this narrative. Right? First, the false narrative that they were going to go nuclear. That was a false narrative. Second false narrative is that sanctions aren't having any effect on Russia. That's false. Right? Their economy is headed for disaster. Right? They are running out of time. The trick here is to up the pressure on Russia, to shorten the time between how long they can continue the war and when does their economy collapse. And that was what Putin won, if it's win or lose, at the Alaska summit, because there were no sanctions, no negative repercussions, right? And I think this has been the problem with the West in general with Putin. The guy never gets punished for anything he does, right? Yeah. Murders political opponents, nothing happens. Launches sabotage campaigns against NATO infrastructure in the Baltic Sea, right? The undersea cables, nothing happens. Shoots down an airliner, nothing happens. they assassinate or try to assassinate spies who've been resettled in the West. Nothing happens, right? They were going to assassinate the CEO of Rheinmetall in Germany. Nothing happened. They were putting explosives on DHL cargo planes coming out of Lithuania. Nothing happened, right? And now drones over Poland. What has happened, right? Not much. So there, at no point has the West truly held Vladimir Putin accountable for his actions. And he just takes that as a green light to continue.
But it basically works both ways because like Western partners of Ukraine cross Putin's red lines and nothing happens. And also Putin cross Western red lines and also nothing happens. So to which extent it may go on?
Well, you know, looking at the past pattern indefinitely, right? At some point, someone's got to step up and stick to a red line.
Yeah, like this is real red line.
Yes,
so
and I'm hoping that NATO will be the first ones. You know, for instance, the Russian drones over Poland. I mean, 2 or 3, that's a navigational error. 19 or 23 drones, that's a deliberate probe, right? And frankly, I agree with the people who say there should be, NATO should extend like a no-fly zone, at least over parts of Ukraine that are the approaches to Poland, and if not, maybe the whole country, maybe a defensive air cap over all of Ukraine.
And also, Trump was or is maybe trying to improve his ties with Russia, but why at the same time he is so openly undermining relations with Europe? Yeah,
so you know, this is just part of when I said earlier that President Trump is a complex man, right? On the one hand, I understand his thinking in terms of making friends with Russia, because we have to admit, Russia is a nuclear power, right? Their conventional military, as we joke, went from being the second best army in the world to the second best army in Ukraine, right? But they still have this strategic capability that is an existential threat to the United States. So, you know, the president thinks, okay, this is a country we need to work out some sort of modus vivendi. We need to live with these people. But at the same time, unfortunately, I don't think you can have it both ways. I don't think you can extend friendship to this country and then think you can bludgeon them into some sort of peace agreement. It's one or the other. And frankly, I think we need to put the pressure on them for a peace agreement in Ukraine.
So, okay, what's next? Earlier this year, you shared insight that the front line would become deadly, filled with drones and essentially impossible to move.
Yeah.
Do you see this happening now?
Yes.
And do you expect any breakthroughs for either side?
Well, this is the beauty and the horror of war is things can change rapidly, right? I don't see that happening in my tours to several headquarters out east. Morale was high. They seemed to have the situation under control. No one was panicking, right? But unfortunately, like I said earlier, there is this steady encroachment as the Russians move forward at tremendous losses, right? And the Russians are beginning to deal with this new reality because the front is an extremely lethal place, right? That's already true, right? I mean, I've watched videos on YouTube. I've probably watched too many videos on YouTube for my mental health, but I've watched these videos of Russian soldiers being pursued by multiple drones. One soldier being chased by 3 drones. That's terrifying, right? So that lethal front, that exists now. And, you know, for the Russians, it's a matter of trying to destroy anything that moves. For the Ukrainians, it's a matter of trying to save the lives of their own men, right? There's a huge imbalance here where the Russians are willing to just throw their men into the meat grinder with the hopes that at the end of the day, they'll have gained a new fighting position a few meters forward. Maybe they lost 50 guys, but they got 2 guys there and the Ukrainians had to pull back, right? So in the meantime, the Ukrainians are forced to try and save their men, right? It's just the math just does not, unfortunately, work in favor of Ukraine. But, you know, one of the things I heard last week too was that on the front lines, Ukrainian soldiers are capturing Russians who 12 days before were at home. So from the time a Russian soldier signs his contract and leaves his house and shows up on the front and is either killed or captured is 12 days, right? So what that tells me as a former military person is that guy has had almost no training. He's just been thrown into combat. And the fact that President Putin thinks that he can do this indefinitely is very worrying. But at the same time, I don't think he can do it indefinitely. The Russian economy, again, if we can put enough pressure on there, eventually time will run out for Vladimir Putin and the Russians.
But he has a lot of people to put to Ukraine. But we have, I think, big problem with manpower.
Yes.
And how our Western partners can help us with that.
Yeah. So, I mean, they're not going to help with manpower, right? They're not going to send people here, although, countries can make it possible for their citizens to volunteer to fight in Ukraine, right? Like make sure it's not illegal for them to come here, right? Some countries, I think, have done that. But what they can do is make sure that Ukraine has the weaponry and the supplies they need. For instance, last year when there was a freeze on support to Ukraine because the bill was stuck in Congress as the new government was arguing over this, when that stuff finally was released, it was literally coming at the last moment, and the ZSU, they were holding on by their fingernails, and that stuff just got there in time. And we can't allow that again, right? Because if you have new recruits, right, they're going to be a lot more willing to go serve if they know that they will have the proper weaponry and the proper supplies of ammunition, and if they know that there's medical care waiting for them if they get hurt. But that whole equation gets thrown out the window if we have these extremely damaging political disputes in the West that holds up the aid. So we've got to keep this stuff flowing, and we've got to keep it flowing on time.
And how do you see the end of this war, and especially security guarantees? How basically this war can end?
Yeah. So if it were up to me, it would end now. Realistically, I think we see a situation where the front line is frozen in place, right? I think it's absurd to think that Ukraine will give up a single centimeter of territory that doesn't have a Russian boot on it. But it's unrealistic to think the Russians are going to give up any territory that has a Russian boot on it. So freeze the lines in place, right? And then for security guarantees, the West, again, they're going to have to pressure the Russians to accept this. There's going to have to be some sort of foreign troop presence in country. Ukrainians will not be able to do it themselves. And these demands of Vladimir Putin that Ukraine is disarmed and has to maintain just a small force, that's just
this will never happen.
That will never happen, right? Not too many people have been killed in this war for Ukraine to simply give in without fighting for it.
Could Putin attack Poland or Baltic countries after these negotiations with Ukraine after the war settled?
So I think there's a lot of people out there who see Putin, this is his grand strategy, Ukraine and then Poland or the Baltics. I think if he gets his way in Ukraine, right, if he's allowed to take as much territory as he wants, if a peace is settled on his terms and not on Western terms, if there aren't adequate security guarantees, then yeah, I think he does represent a threat to Poland and particularly the Baltics. He can do the same thing in, for instance, Estonia. He can claim that, the Estonians are mistreating the ethnic Russians in Narva. In he goes, right? Nothing, particularly if he feels that he still has red line dominance. I don't think that's likely, though. I think if things are frozen in place, there's security guarantees, I think he'll be stymied. But then the danger is he'll double down on what we call the gray zone, right? Which is more sabotage in the West, more cyber attacks, more paying criminals through the internet to set shopping malls on fire, or hiring recruiting agents through the internet to destroy military facilities or ammunition plants. I think we'll see more of that because, again, he's been doing this for several years now and has never really been held accountable.
Yeah, and finally, what future do you see for Ukraine and Europe after the war? Will things get better? Will Ukraine be in European Union or maybe in NATO?
Yeah, I'm an incurable optimist in spite of 35 years in the CIA. I see EU for sure. In fact, the quicker the better for Ukraine, right? I like to joke that as Ukraine is being rebuilt, the people in the occupied territories who are happy to be in Russia, they'll be sitting there in their outdoor outhouse because they don't have indoor plumbing, and they'll be reading by candle. They'll be reading by the light that shines through the window from the Ukrainian cities on the other side that are being rebuilt, and they're going to think that maybe they picked the wrong side. Right, so I'm more optimistic for this side than I am for that side.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to have you here.
My pleasure. Thank you for your great questions.
That's all for today. Our guest was Ralph Goff, former CIA officer, and my name is Maria Kagal. Don't forget to like this video, comment, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, Ukraine Breaking News.
Great. Slava Ukraini.
Thank you. Героям слава.